And I think this is a very appropriate pairing for many reasons, but one of them is that they have known each other for a long time. Going back to Marina's days in London working for the BBC, they've known each other, they've known many people in common, they've had many common experiences. So I honestly cannot think of a better person to have this conversation with Margaret, unless we've been able to clone Margaret herself. Anyway, you did not come here to hear me. I'm going to hand over now to Marina. Have a wonderful afternoon, and I'll see you again at the end to give you a send-off when all is said and done.
Thank you, Nicholas. Welcome, Margaret.
Thank you, Marina.
Margaret Busby, CBE, Honorary Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, Nana Akwa Akom, can be easily described as one of the most important and unique people in the world of publishing and literature. For the last 6 decades, she's been at the center of the literary world in the UK, and her influence is extended beyond to Africa, North America, and the Caribbean. When I was thinking of starting BOCUS, LitFest, she was one of the first people I went to and said, Margaret, what do you think? And of course, Margaret is a great encourager. She said, yes, you must do it. So Margaret's been to many festivals in the early years. And it wasn't just because she's a friend and somebody I've known for a long time, but she's also been really a hero. Margaret became really legendary, started becoming legendary in the 1960s as a co-founder of the publishing house Allison and Busby. And she'd rescued the writing of many touchstone black writers, people like C.L.R. James and George Lamming, to name just two. But she also put many people on the map, people such as Sam Greenlee, Chester Himes and Buchi Emecheta. And you published about 300 writers under that imprint, maybe more. Margaret's been the cheerleader for African American and Caribbean writers, intellectuals and artists, and her dedication and effect are unrivaled. She was a person who in the 1990s, I asked to abridge for the BBC Radio the wonderful first novel, Witch Broom, of Trini writer Lawrence Scott. And Margaret abridged, I produced, and Lawrence read, and wrote and read. And that was a really thrilling thing because we were 3 Trinis, and we'd done this thing together, which is pretty unheard of in those days. So
never again.
Never again, yeah. Not because it was bad, it was brilliant.
It was just rare.
Yeah. Lawrence always says that it was one of the useful things in helping him launch that book and maybe the rest of his career. Many of you would know her. She's got 2 groundbreaking anthologies, Daughters of Africa in 1992 and New Daughters of Africa in 2019. And some of the people in this room have written in one or other of those. Together they contain the writing of over 400 women of African origin from around the world. And with all of that, little attention has been paid to her own skills as a writer herself, as Nicholas said. Part of the story, Writing from Half a Century, is a very suitable title of the glorious 512-page book collection. It's substantial, and you've probably left a lot of it out. Yep. Over 50 years as an editor, publisher, feature writer, script writer, obituary writer, essayist, columnist, lyricist, reviewer, broadcaster, activist, and commentator on a wide range of subjects. As many of you know, Margaret is internationally recognized for being Britain's youngest and first black woman editor and publisher. At a party while still an undergraduate, you were in your last year.
Yeah, that's when it was conceived.
She met a man, as one does, at a party. His name was Clive Allison. And they decided to start an imprint, Allison and Busby. And it still survives, nearly 60 years on. Margaret tells this wonderful story about not really knowing what the hell they should be doing. So how did you sell the books, Margaret?
Well, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, we printed, we didn't know how many copies to print of our first 3 cheap poetry books, which we wanted to produce because we wanted young people like us to be able to afford it. So we had 15,000 5-shilling, 5-bob poetry books and no distribution. So
nobody produces 100 and how many? 15,000 copies of any book, right?
Poetry.
Let alone poetry, right?
So we would stop people in the street saying, do you want to buy a poetry book? Or knock on doors. That was our distribution.
But it didn't stop them. Alison and Busby still survive, and Margaret has received very, very many accolades. Among them, the Booker's Henry Swansea Award in recognition of her contribution to Caribbean literature. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you back here, and
Thank
certainly
you,
as a
Marina.
writer. I'd like to start by asking you to read from what you wrote for the Griffin Review, number 59, Commonwealth Now, 2018, so that we can get a little sense of how Margaret came to be Margaret and what propelled you to achieve what you have done. Would you like, yes?
Okay, this is from something written in 2019, but it's called Trumpeting Our Words, from the Griffith Review. There comes a stage in life when one sometimes forgets to celebrate the passing years. Truth be told, it's hard enough just to keep up with them. They pass so quickly. Recently, a long-time friend knocked on my front door, bearing an early birthday gift, a large, round patisserie tin containing a tasty-looking confection topped with blackberries and icing. Delicious as the cake looked, the real present, she told me, was the tin, an antique of sorts, showing its age a little around the edges, like me. About 9 inches in diameter, the tin had Côte d'Or written in large brown and gold curvy letters, canopied over a stylized drawing in cream, ochre, and umber of a side-facing elephant, trunk aloft, palm trees and pyramids in the background. Further investigation later that day told me that this was the branding of a chocolate-producing Belgian company, founded in 1883 and trading under a pseudo-French translation of the name Gold Coast, the one-time British colony where I was born, and which was the source of much of the cocoa used in manufacturing chocolates. I can vouch for there being cocoa and palm trees in present-day independent Ghana. Gold Coast was dropped with independence in 1957. Though in all the decades of my acquaintance with my native land, I have never run into an elephant there, let alone a pyramid. Were things that different before I was born? On my wall used to be an old map purporting to be of ancient Africa, across vast areas of which was printed the legend Terrae Incognitae, dated 1798. In the course of the next century, European explorers and colonists would scramble to name and claim most of that terrain, discovering what already existed. Whereas in 1870, only 10% of Africa was under European control, by 1914, the figure had increased to almost 90%. The elephant and palm tree image on the tin references the coat of arms with a background of, that's better, green hills, used by the British on the flag of their crown colony, the Gold Coast, as on that other West African territories to which they laid claim. The landscape of my mind was seeded with things British, thanks to my birth in a continent whose map still blushed with much colonial pink. I was schooled in England, earned a degree in English literature at London University, yet everything is subjective. We are each the center of our world, and I will never know what it is like to be anything other than African-born and female, educated in the somewhat United Kingdom, with family branches in the Commonwealth of Dominica, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, and other diasporic realms such as Antigua and Barbados. My father was born in the Caribbean at the turn of the century, and from his earliest days was steeped in an appreciation of the British way of life. In Trinidad, where he was raised, he had been bright enough to gain entry to Queen's Royal College, QRC, regarded as the island's bastion of secondary school education. QRC had been established in Port of Spain in the second half of the 19th century and was run according to the model of an English public school, complete with Oxford-educated masters. A contemporary of my father's and his lifelong friend was the historian and political philosopher C.L.R. James, who in his classic memoir, Beyond the Boundary, 1963, wrote tellingly of the expectations that West Indian boys such as he and my father imbibed along with the diet of British culture. This is what C.L.R. wrote. It was only long years after that I understood the limitation on spirit, vision, and self-respect which is imposed on us by the fact that our masters, our curriculum, our code of morals, everything began from the basis that Britain was the source of all light and leading, and our business was to admire, wonder, imitate, learn. Our criterion of success was to have succeeded in approaching that distant ideal. To attain it, of course, was impossible. Both masters and boys accepted it as the very nature of things. It was the beacon that beckoned me on. At QRC, aged 11, my father won first prize in Form 3, which came with a copy of Cervantes' Don Quixote, or Don Quixote, inscribed by the headmaster, William Burslem, a man who elicited the description from C.L.R. James of being part Pickwick, part Dr. Johnson, part Samuel Smiles, an Englishman of the 19th century, no more devoted, conscientious, and self-sacrificing official ever worked in the colonies. It was to Burslam's teaching that James ascribed his love of cricket and English literature. A more momentous triumph for my father was winning the coveted Ireland Scholarship, which launched him on an irreversible trajectory. It offered the opportunity to study medicine in Britain, first in Edinburgh, then in Dublin, and on qualifying as a doctor, he went into general practice in Walthamstow, East London. From there, he migrated in 1929 to West Africa, setting up a clinic in a rural area of the Gold Coast where there were no medical facilities and few comforts. He married my mother, a UK-qualified midwife and nursing sister in her own right, and she became his stalwart helpmate, bearing him a son and 2 daughters, of whom I was the youngest. Our early childhood years seemed more adventure than anything, spent surrounded by palm trees, sugarcane, and cocoa farms, in daily acquaintance with friends and mosquitoes, with lizards and mosquitoes, having occasional encounters with snakes, kerosene lamps, substituting for electricity, and flush toilets being a luxury to aspire to. But when the time came for me and my older siblings to go to school, with scant choice available in the bush, we were destined to be sent away to obtain the start in life that our hard-working parents wished for us. They were prepared to make any sacrifice necessary. That being the case, a British education beckoned. So it was that my sister and I found ourselves the first Africans at an international boarding school in Sussex. For the first time, I became conscious of myself as an African, simply because that's how others identified me. Yet I found myself in an environment where nothing seemed to affirm my African identity. From my school friends, I might have learned how to count in Farsi or to curse in Mandarin, but in every other aspect, I received a thoroughly English education, the team games of hockey and netball included. Reading for an English degree at London University rounded things off nicely. By the time I ended my formal education, my literary references were a respectable mix of Shakespeare and Chaucer, Dickens, Milton, Donne, Virgil, and Cicero, even Molière, Corneille, Ronsard, and Du Bellay. However, nowhere in my formal education, my formal school or university curriculum did I come into contact with a single book by an African, or by anyone not an acknowledged representative of European civilization. Certainly, as far as my English education was concerned, and thank goodness it's no longer the case today, there were no black writers. As the years passed, and I swung into the 60s, it occurred to me that this was an absence too far, amounting to an erasure of my identity. There was no acknowledgement of how my presence and history connected with everything else I had been taught during the years in England. Trying to find that connection, I sought out any text that made reference to my continent or to African peoples anywhere. Briefly, in the early 1960s, I was an avid reader of a short-lived literary magazine called Donna London's, which, to my delight, featured a South African woman columnist called Noni Jabavu. Happening upon the African Writers series, initiated by Heinemann Educational Books in the 1960s, was a life-changing experience. To read writers such as Chinua Achebe and Florent Nwapa was to locate the missing pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. I also discovered the occasional anthology of American Negro poetry, such as Beyond the Blues, 1962, edited by Dr. Rosie E. Poole, which provided fodder for articles I foisted on my college literary magazine for an enlightenment of my English peers. And from then on, my personal library swelled daily with volumes that affirmed my identity in an environment where I was often the only person of color. By the time I became a publisher myself, teaming up in a somewhat arbitrary way with another young quixotic dreamer called Clive Allison to start our own company, Allison and Busby, was conceived at a party where we first met as undergraduates. I had long given up on settling for the status quo when it came to an industry then dominated by elderly white gentlemen. We had determined that our first 3 Allison and Busby... Is that enough? Okay, I'll stop there. Sorry, I'm being sorry.
Everybody was very engrossed, but we want to have a little chat as well.
Yeah, sorry, I'm getting carried away.
Yeah. So of course, what Margaret did with Clive's help was to really take on the battle and prove that there were black writers and African writers and then Caribbean writers and lots of other
writers of the world. We were not only publishing black writers.
So who else did you publish?
Who else did we publish? Michelangelo, will that do? Mm-hmm. We published a 16th century Japanese samurai.
Anthony Burgess and yeah.
But Anthony Burgess, Hungarian writers, French writers. We published just what we wanted to publish. We were not being confined by what people thought we should publish.
The book is interesting because it's divided into different sections. The first section is actually the first 2 decades of starting, and then 3 decades separately.
Well, it's arranged chronologically from the earliest things that I had published in the British press. In fact, the earliest piece in the book dates from just after I left university in 1966, before anybody was born, including me.
I wasn't born. When you gathered up all those pieces of writing, it must have been very strange for you because you're used to being an editor.
Yeah,
and now you're being told. How difficult was that for you?
Well, I'm lucky that I was taken on by the wonderful Simon Prosser at Hamish Hamilton, and he had a younger editor who looked after me called Ruby. So it was great to be surrounded by positive people who really wanted to publish me, but it was quite strange because, as you say, I'm used to being an editor, and suddenly I was being edited, having an editor. I was used to being a publisher, and suddenly...
Were you well behaved?
Was I well behaved?
Yeah.
Of course I was. No, I mean, sometimes you had to restrain yourself. I mean, I might have said, well, if I had been publishing this, I wouldn't have had that, or I'd have changed that, or if I had been the editor, I wouldn't. But of course, they have their high style, and they have their opinions, and they have to decide how long they want the book to be and what shape they want it to be. So,
What was it like, that experience of looking back at your life and all the things you'd written about? Did it match what you thought you'd achieved and what you thought you'd done?
did it match? Good question. No, I think a lot of things. Actually, I've not read this, but you read it. I haven't. I just hopped on. No, I mean it's quite strange to reread things you've written decades ago, and once or twice you can actually correct a typo, so that's good. But usually you have to see it within the context. You have to say, well, I wrote this not because I suddenly got up one morning and said I want to write about this subject or this person or this situation, but it was that I had been asked to write about this or review this particular book. So, in a way, I was responding to the times, because, well, you're not old enough to know what went on in the 60s or 70s, are you?
I just said I wasn't born.
Well, I mean, if you remember, for example, in the 60s, all the things that women could not do.
I want to read to you something that Margaret wrote in the 1960s. I think it's the first bit of writing in the book. I want to ask you whether you would write like this now. She writes this for the New Statesman in 25th November 1966. Now, in the 1960s in Britain, politics were very much left and right, hard split, correct? Mm-hmm. So you had a real Labour Party and a real Conservative Party. And a New Statesman is on the left. She writes this.
I just sent it to them. They didn't ask me to write that one.
Oh, you wrote this? Oh, see, they were really right on. Everybody's doing it from the outside, in the press, on TV. Now let's talk about being black from the inside. In this country, it means getting used to a number of things. The iatrogenic diseases of unprejudice. First, there's all the bending over backwards that goes on among the agile, self-appointed spreaders of enlightenment to put one at one's ease. And I think James Baldwin writes marvelously syndrome. Then one is expected to epitomize black peoples everywhere and to act as their unofficial spokesman. What exactly is the situation in Nigeria or Mississippi or Jamaica? Not to mention the fact that one is liable to imitate if unintentionally reflects categorization. In school plays, one is cast rather too obviously as a Nubian slave, complete with loincloth. What is this? With this go the misguided compliments. Your people have a natural sense of rhythm. And what of that guilty habit of shifting the responsibility of prejudice onto some other conveniently absent faction? A headmistress politely declining to accept my sister and myself as pupils, once told my mother, of course we'd love to have them, but the parents of the other girls. Now, Margaret, that is pretty feisty stuff. Would you write that now, you think? I mean, do you think that kind of writing, given the nature of the discourse, would you write that now, you think?
Would I write it now? I could, I might. The thing is, I was too young to know any better. I mean, I was too, I just thought I want to write something. New Statesman is a reputable publication. I'll send it to them. And they published it. And in fact, they wanted me to have a column, but I said, no, I'm becoming a publisher.
So they actually wanted you to be feisty?
Well, I suppose it was different.
Yeah. The thing about it is, at the BBC, I was once invited by a very well-intentioned producer who wanted to come up, who thought, that the things we were doing for the children should be more diverse. And being the only person of colour in the BBC, working in production at that time, she called me and said, Marina, we need a black opinion. Could you take...
Yeah, I recognise that.
Now, of course, that's not something that I would write about, and I wouldn't write about it now, because I think that it's it's much more sophisticated how people write and talk about these things. I don't think that is quite the thing anymore.
What?
When you were looking back at some of the pieces, do you feel that that any of them, looking at across the years, do you recognize the transformative? Do you recognize the shifts, the transformative moments in not just the lives of ethnic minorities, let's call them that, but in your own life and the way you perceive things?
The way I perceive things may not have changed, but certainly the societal things have changed. So things that I might have said in the 60s or 70s or 80s, might not be allowed to say now. I mean, if I think even of some of the titles of the books I published, they would probably not be allowed now. I mean, a film by Horace Ove called Baldwin's N-word. He wasn't called that, actually, but you're not allowed to say that in certain scenarios. So there are things that we were doing and publishing that were happening and nobody was actually objecting to them, that they certainly would object to now. Mm-hmm. And I suppose that's what actually worries me about the situation now within publishing is all the talk about sensitivity readers. I mean, do you understand what that means? Not having somebody within the company who's sensitive enough to tell you not to do something. You've got to go outside to some specialist sensitive person. I can't figure that out.
Yeah, I think it might be called political correctness, gone too far. Political correctness gone too far. You published, it's interesting, all of this going on, because at the same time, I didn't know about CLR James going to school in Trinidad when in the late 1960s and 60s. He wasn't on our radar because of course, Minty Alley, which was published originally in 1936, perhaps?
In fact, I think it was the first novel published in Britain by a black writer.
Yeah, well, that was out of print. Beyond the Boundary was out of print.
No, I knew CLR, as I said, because my father and he were friends since their school days. So I knew him, I'd read him, I knew why he was important. So when I was a publisher, it was very strange to me that he was out of print mostly, including his landmark book, The Black Jacobins. In Britain, it was not in print in the 70s. So I decided to try and bring CLR back into print. And we started with 3 volumes of selected writings, essays and articles that he'd written. But we also published a book that hadn't been published before called Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution by CLR, which is a new edition of The Black Jacobins with a new preface by CLR. We did Mariners, Renegades and Castaways. So we were trying to showcase as much of CLR's work as we could, because we thought he was an important writer and he shouldn't be out of print.
This is interesting because I came to know of CLR James and other people like me who were sort of relatively well-educated Caribbean people in Britain, because you'd done that, because I came to know about him through my English friends, and they said, do you know this very good? And of course, I had to pretend I knew him never, so I quickly went and read about him. And there was a direct effect of the work. It wasn't just you were just publishing and putting it out there. It really did change the way in which we were perceived as intellectuals. People, I actually met people who didn't ask me whether Trinidad was in Jamaica, which was used to be very common before you did that. So I think that there's a direct impact of your work in that way. But you wrote in The Guardian at one point that fiction had drained away from him, and that he went on to do these other things. I just wonder if you think that he should have gone on writing fiction, or...
He could well have done. He was a good writer. But I think what happened, perhaps, is that politics overtook what he wanted to do in that fictional way. So he was writing things that were non-fiction, historical, political, rather than imaginative in terms of characters who didn't exist or things like that. So he could have had a career, I think, probably as a novelist had he chosen to, but he had many more important things in his mind, I guess, to do.
Yeah. I hadn't thought about it before, but when I was reading the pieces, I reflected upon how much he dealt with the idea of identity. And it wasn't called identity, and it wasn't called identity politics then, but he was claiming personhood, and he was claiming, which I thought perhaps appealed to people without them really knowing what it was or giving it a name. Do you think that's possibly true?
Well, that he...
He started this whole thing about...
Well, I suppose that's his one way of looking at it. I mean, it's a good question, but I'd never thought of that. But he certainly...
community. I mean, the whole idea that everything was founded in groups and community.
And that rootedness in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, the fact that he didn't see it as just some little piece of land that didn't have much relevance to the rest of the world. It was central. It was... he was a centre of his own person. So I think the influence... In fact, it's interesting. There is now in Dalston, in London, a CLR James Library. And I remember many years ago somebody asked me, who exactly is Councillor James? I think probably he's better known now. But in fact, when we published the third volume of collected writings, we had a photograph on the cover done by Anthony Armstrong-Jones. So he'd gone from nobody knowing who he was to having an eminent photographer feature him on the cover.
I think that James became very, very important for a lot of writers. He was a sort of standard setter, somebody they can get the measure from. And
but also the fact that he was dealing with Haiti, which remains a central problem in terms of political life and history, and the fact that the Black Jacobins was so iconic and remains so. I mean, I remember listening to David Rudder singing about Toussaint with CLR, and I might have imagined it, but I remember CLR saying the first two lines, which go, Toussaint was a mighty man, and to make matters worse, he was black. I can hear CLR's voice in my head.
Would you say that CLR was the first of the black writers in that sense, and sort of claiming that space? Among the people you published, not the African American writers, because they were kind of doing that, but among the Caribbean writers, we
were publishing. In fact, when I was publishing, I wasn't thinking of writers in terms of ethnicity. Mm-hmm. I was thinking of them in terms of what they were writing and their importance. I mean, the very first novelist we published, actually, I write about it, I think, in the book quite often, because that was the first novel we published was also the first full-time book that we published, because Margaret Busby had no money. So both Clive Allison, and I should clear it up, Clive Allison was simply my business partner. We never had any personal connection. He was married to somebody else, I was married to a jazz musician, although everybody thought that he was my boss, because, how could a black woman be equal to him? But anyway, so we both had jobs with other publishing companies, and in 1968, a friend of my then husband's met this African-American in Mykonos, Greek island. This guy was called Sam Greenlee, and he'd been trying to get his first novel published and had been rejected on both sides of the Atlantic by maybe 40 publishers. And this friend, Alexis Lickiard, who I went on to publish as well, said, I know somebody who started a publishing house, or maisonette, or company. So Sam was directed to me in London, and I worked with him on the manuscript, and we decided this was an important political book. We wanted it to be our first full-time publication.
It's so wonderful. Has anybody read that book? It's
called The Spook Who Sat by the Door.
The Spook Who Sat by the Door. Have anybody read it? It's a wonderful one. I can still remember it. Amazing book.
It was.
Is it out of print?
No, it was reprinted by Jacaranda.
Oh, wonderful! Yeah, I really recommend that book.
But it was. In fact, it's still relevant. It was like a diversity parable. It's about this. The CIA decide that they've been accused of not having black employees, so they employ this, really talented black man who has to pass all these tests to get the job, and he is prominently there to display how unprejudiced they are, how diverse they are. And anyway, I won't spoil it, but it's a parable about people trying to show how correct they are and how inclusive they are, and the consequences. And it went on to become a film. In fact, I was in South Africa last year, being honoured. I got an honorary doctorate from the University of Johannesburg, and there was a press professor there who was making a citation, and she was making a direct connection between the publication of The Spook Who Sat by the Door and that film Sinners, because she was saying that had that film, The Spook, not been published by a black director, Ivan Dixon, the whole trajectory of black filmmaking might not have led up to Sinners. So, I felt responsible for Sinners.
How long? Because at that time, of course, the blaxploitation movies were starting, weren't they?
Well, it's one of the earliest blaxploitation movies.
Yeah.
It was amazing. In fact, because it was our earliest first full-time book, I was doing. I not only edited it, I did the cover myself. I wrote the blurb. In fact, we had to get some endorsements by anybody we could find. So I remember, I think Dick Gregory was in town to publish his autobiography. So he gave us a quote for the cover, as did. There was a Hungarian-Canadian writer called Stephen Wysensee, who just published a best-selling book called In Praise of Older Women. He gave us a quote. So we just cobbled things together, and we decided we wanted to get this book serialized in a national newspaper. So we sent. It's a bit like not knowing how to distribute 15,000 poetry books. We decided we wanted to get this in a national newspaper, not knowing that it wasn't a done thing. So we sent the manuscript to the Observer, and of course they rejected it, saying, well, you should know we don't publish fiction, and if we did, it wouldn't be a Black Power first novel like this. Now, not knowing any better, we sent it back to them, saying, you're wrong, and they did it.
That's how you do it. That's how you do it, right?
And we went on, we sold translation rights in many languages, we sold paperback rights back to America. And so we were just bumbling our way along, not knowing what...
Was that, in fact, the most successful publication you had? Because did you sell the film rights and all that as well? Translation rights?
The film rights were sold. I don't think we profited. We had lots of successful books in terms of prizes. We won the Guardian Fiction Prize 2 years running, once with Roy Heath, a Guyanese writer, and another time with a science fiction writer called Michael Moorcock. So we were winning prizes, but we still had no money, which is why I was doing all this, other work, working for the BBC African Service.
So Margaret not only was editing books and publishing, she was also writing a lot of journalism, doing lots of interviews, etc. And in the book, this wonderful book, there are amazing encounters with all these extraordinary writers, Maya Angelou, Toni Morrison. In fact, there's this wonderful, is it Toni Morrison? I think Toni Morrison says this wonderful thing in the book. It's the difference between involvement and commitment. And Toni Morrison says, and I've stolen it and I've used it. It says,
I use it all the time.
Toni Morrison says, the difference between involvement and commitment is like involvement? It's like the breakfast.
English breakfast.
It's like an English breakfast. the hen is involved, but the pig is committed. And it's full of wonderful stories like that and encounters.
But the interesting thing, you mentioned Toni Morrison. Well, it's interesting how late her general fame came. Because she'd been, in fact, when I started, she was the only other black editor I knew. She was then an editor for Random House in the 70s. And she'd begun writing as well. Her novels were published in the 70s. So by the time Beloved was being published in 1987, and she was in London for the British publication, and there was a television program who were going to have Toni and me on talking about publishing, I think, or editing. And at the last minute, the item was dropped. And I think that this was because I heard from somebody who worked there, because it was thought that Toni wasn't well enough known. And so we decided we're going to make our own film. So there was a young fledgling filmmaker called a Ghanese woman called Tindamni Bridgelord, who just finished film school. Toni had an hour free in her publicity schedule, so I didn't have time to reread the books. And we made our own interview with Toni. And then she went on the next month to win a Pulitzer Prize. And then we sold it back to Channel 4. But then, that didn't end then, because that was in the 80s. In 1992, which is when Derek Walcott won the Nobel Prize.
Suddenly.
And he was not then part of the mainstream literary scene, although I'd interviewed him for Work Talk? Anyway, I'd interviewed him on radio. So I was being phoned up. Quickly, can you write something about Derek Walcott by 4:30 for our papers tomorrow? And then the next year, Toni Morrison won the Nobel Prize. The same thing happened. Nobody knew about Toni Morrison. In fact, somebody said to me, Toni Morrison, who's he? So that's how late her fame and acclaim came, although she'd been writing since the early 70s.
Toni Morrison is an interesting person because, she developed into this huge icon and a little bit scary, I think. But she said one thing that you mentioned in the book, which struck a chord with me. She says, I always wanted to develop a way of writing that is irrevocably black. The literature would do one day. I was just wondering, having chaired the OCM Booker's Prize this year and chaired many, many, many prizes, and have an intimate knowledge of Caribbean literature, whether you think that there's something irrevocably Caribbean about the way in which we are writing. This is very distinctive from you not just, but recently been judging many prizes, including the Booker Prize. Do you think there's something irrevocably Caribbean in our writing, and is that something?
I wouldn't generalize. I think well, we come back to each of us as the centre of our own world. So I admire a writer such as Earl Lovelace, who's always been based here. Mm-hmm. But we have writers. I say we. I'm now pretending to be from the Caribbean, who are based everywhere. So, we claim the world. Why shouldn't we write about ourselves in any context? Mm-hmm. We don't even need a label. I mean...
And I think that is one of the secrets of Margaret's success. I've known you for nearly 40 years or something. And it's amazing to me the way in which you've never seemed to have any problem that a lot of other people have of defining who they are. You've never seemed to have had an identity crisis. You just slip in and out of all of these Englishness and Africanness and Caribbeanness and
you.
Yeah, it's amazing, and I think that's the secret. You haven't been. Kanisha Lubrin was saying earlier, sitting here, that this thing of identity could lock you in, this question of identity and finding your identity and defining yourself against something that perhaps somebody else has said can be very reducing.
I think each of us is made up of so many elements, our parents, our friends, the associations we've had throughout our lives. It's not just one thing. And sometimes there's pressure from, I don't know, maybe it's the publishing industry to try and label you and say, you must represent all women from wherever. I've heard people in the past who said they tried to get agents, and an agent said, well, I'd love to take you on, but we've already got one black writer.
Yeah. Well, there's this thing that there's only room for one person, one different person, and you have to take it in turns.
Well, this is exactly why I did, and you mentioned the anthologies. I mean, Daughters of Africa came out in 1992, and that had more than 200 women of African heritage, African descent, going back to ancient Egypt. And that was because back in the late 80s, when I conceived the anthology, you'd have thought there were just half a dozen black women writers, and they were all African-American, and they were all great, Toni Morrison, Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Terry McMillan. And I want to say they're all there, and they're all in my anthology, but here are hundreds more. Mm-hmm. And it goes back. It's not just they've arrived now. In fact, C.L.R. James wrote a wonderful essay about black women writers. It wasn't an essay. He delivered an address that I included it in his selected writings to show that there are so many women writers, particularly, who deserve to be given attention, be read, given the spotlight. Because what I used to find, and I loved anthologies, I was always looking for anthologies because that was one way you could connect with writing from that you could identify with. So I'd find an anthology of, poetry from Africa. In fact, I took Wale Soyinka to task about that because I said he'd done an anthology, and I said there weren't enough women in it. So he wrote me a letter saying he'd try and do better the next time. Mm-hmm. So you'd find anthologies, short stories from the West Indies. He wouldn't say by men, but you wouldn't find many women, if any. Yeah. So it was trying to remedy that I made me think I should do those anthologies. That was certainly the first one in 1992. And then the second one, which you're in, thank you, Marina, it came out in 2019, had another 200 women, over 200 years, completely different, just to show that there were so many writers who could be given the spotlight, who could be read by anyone. And it's not only that they had to be read by women, and they didn't have to write in any one genre. I just wanted to say, well, read these people. This is good reading. And apart from the good reading, it's the fact that all of you, together with the publishers and we all got together, you waived, everybody, all the authors waived their fees, so that we had this award, which means that a woman student from the African continent gets a free course of study at London University because of the anthology that you contributed to.
That's an amazing initiative. That's really wonderful.
Well,
it's those sorts of interventions that really make a difference.
But it also, to me, it exemplifies that sisterhood. So it's not that we're all competing with one another. Mm-hmm. We're all passing it on, helping each other, sharing whatever we can share. So that to me has been the most satisfying part of being in a position where I could enable things like that.
There's so much to talk to Margaret about. We haven't even talked about the politics of the whole thing. We haven't talked about the money. We haven't talked about the famous people she's met, like, who hasn't she met? I think you talk a lot about Stevie Wonder. Is there a special story about Stevie Wonder? He turns up in all your pictures. Margaret is always taking pictures.
Yeah.
So not only she's got how many millions and millions of pictures.
I have no idea, but
I don't know where you store everything.
In the cloud.
Now you do. It's amazing. But listen, I'm sure you've got some questions because we haven't touched on very much in this last hour, really.
Have we had an hour already?
Yes. So who would like to ask some questions of Margaret? Many questions I'm sure you've got. Yeah.
Thank you. It's actually more of a statement. I think a lot of us have forgotten that C.L.R. James was persona non grata in Trinidad for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In fact, there's a QRC publication, I was trying to find the date, of all their famous boys, old boys, and he doesn't figure in it at all. Now he does.
Yeah.
So the point I want to make is that you supporting his prominence within the UK meant that we could easily rediscover him when we had the equanimity to do so. So thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Any others?
Well, now that you've said it, I need to know more about the Stevie Wonder story. Can you tell us a little bit about this relationship with Stevie Wonder?
I'm part of it. We're all part of the story.
There's a wonderful part of the book in which, on Margaret's mother's side, which tribe is it? In Ghana?
We're Fantis. I was
Fanti.
born, when you go through your mother, so I was born in Ghana, my mother was born in Ghana, her mother was born in Ghana, or the Gold Coast. So you go through the matrilineal side, we're all Fantis.
So Margaret is it's almost like being a chief, right? There's this wonderful essay. It's not an essay. We've run out of time, but it's one of the most beautifully written pieces in the book, in which Margaret is called to become a nana, right? What is the meaning of that?
Well, nana, it's a title that's given to a chief, and my grandmother's line is linked to something called a Sappho company. A Sappho literally means war people. So they're like a community group, militia group, if you like, defending the locality. And so I was installed, made a nana.
On a stool. You know the wonderful Ghanaian stool? Yeah.
I was called to be, I wasn't allowed to refuse. I was called to be installed in Cape Coast for a Sappho Company #1. And that was I think it was in 1992. So that was through my grandmother's line. And it just was an opportunity to write something about my heritage on that side.
And you wrote that for a newspaper?
I think that was a radio piece I wrote.
A radio piece.
Radio 3, I think.
It's beautifully, beautifully written. And the wonderful thing about the book is that there are all these short essays and talks, etc. And it gives you a really, really good sense of Africa without actually intending to do that. You take them through the independence. You were there at the time.
No, I was. In fact, it goes around the world.
Ghana.
I mean, it's one piece. It's a piece about South Africa. I contribute. Well, it's a piece written for a book about South Africa that came out just when Nelson Mandela was released, and he wrote a foreword to this book. So it's about some different parts of Africa as well as different parts of the world. I mean, I've got a piece about Hastings, which is near where I went to school. So it's just, I really think, I feel that I know where I am from, I know where I was born, I know where my father was born, and my mother's father, and all of us. But I don't see why we shouldn't just claim the world.
And Margaret has been named as the big influence on some of the major contemporary writers in Africa now. Margaret has been called the person who made it happen. She's been called many, many things. I'm just going to read you a couple of accolades. And Margaret might even be a little bit embarrassing. Zadie Smith said, "So many black British artists owe her a debt. I know I do. Bernardine Evaristo, we all walk in the deep prints of her footsteps." How do you feel when you hear all these things? You must feel that you've done well.
Busby.
You must feel you've done something.
No, it's really encouraging to think I've done anything. Certainly if I've enabled somebody else to think they could do something, that's what it's all about. In fact, I always talk about my instinct is to be a backstage person, to be out of sight, to be invisible, because that's what you do if you're an editor. You don't need anybody to know you exist. So the fact that people acknowledge that you've done something that has helped them is just heartwarming. It's just
What Margaret has spent her life doing from the very beginning is fighting for the representation of more writers, not just of colour, but people who should be read that were not there. I mean, we're involved in that at Bookus. I mean, that's what we want to do. We want to bring our writers to the world. But do you think that, well, you've seen it go up and down and up and down. I mean, do you think we're going down or are we going up at the moment? Things are changing.
I think we're going down. I mean, I told you 2019 was the last time I was here, the publication of New Daughters of Africa. And I'd been doing various tours around Britain, festivals and so on. And after one particular festival, I can't even remember where it was, but I remember talking to a member of the audience who said they'd had a discussion from a mainstream publisher. And this publisher had been talking about normal books and diverse books in 2019. And then 2020, when George Floyd was killed, suddenly everybody wanted to come on board the Black Lives Matter. So everybody was trying to show that they had black writers. But I think now, in fact, I read an article in The Guardian with figures to show that the numbers of black writers being published now has gone down.
But does that mean that there's an opportunity, and should we be thinking about, instead of selling our books to them, that we should be doing our own books?
I don't see anything wrong with that, no. Why not?
The problem is, as we know, is the problem is reading is a problem. How many people read?
Well, I think that is something that, I don't know how you would address it here, but reading is something that needs to be encouraged, but also I think you can think of it in terms of words, storage and ideas. And sometimes it's not simply reading on the page. It's hearing, it's watching, it's being involved and committed to literature in whatever way you can access it. And it has to, I mean, one of the things I reference quite often is the fact that the first 3 words I learnt how to spell when a Trini cousin of mine was visiting Ghana with his parents. He was a teenager. He was trying to teach my older brother to spell and drumming out these long words. His name actually was David Busby, although he was called...
David.
Yeah, I mean, all Busbys are called George, but he was George Oliver David, but everybody called him David. So David was trying to teach my brother George to spell. And I was picking up these words because I was just listening in. The first 3 words were necessary, fascinating, and picturesque.
Oh, God.
And
how old are you?
And to me, that's a metaphor. That's a metaphor for how we should approach life and look for it. So, to me, if you have that connection, I think it was about the rhythm of those words that I connected with. Maybe that's why I'm so involved with music and so attracted to music. But I think you can find a way. You can look for ways to make younger people engage with literature and
it's finding the vehicle.
Yeah.
And music is a vehicle. So I remember a teacher in Britain saying to me, it doesn't really matter that young people are listening to those dreadful songs with those dreadful lyrics. But the point about it is at least they're remembering them and they're committing something to memory.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it takes all sorts.
It takes all sorts, yeah.
Margaret, before we close, can I ask you to read a small bit from Nana? There's a piece in it where you get dunked in the water. No. Margaret's book has got lots of pictures in it because of all her pictures. Unfortunately, she couldn't and put any music in, but there's a lot of reference to jazz and music, and she's got this riff going through the book. Nana is on 189. Yeah. It's a bit where, from here? Yeah, you can read a little bit from there.
Okay,
Yes.
I'll start reading. You
Yeah,
start when I-
yeah, okay.
Our footsteps always falter, half a metre above the unforgotten bones of those ancestors. This is the very soil they stood on, we say, this despairing earth nourished by blood and sweat, raised to this level by human dirt and death. For the survivors, the only way out of this airless cell was through the lonely archway called the door of no return, into the small boat that would toss its relentless way toward the waiting ship, the slave ship. Again, today, on the eve of a new millennium, I am here from London on another visit of homage. I have ascended the wide stone steps, looked over the ancient parapet fearlessly out to sea, idly stroked the great grand old guns, tamed now, but once as fierce and awe-inspiring as iron dragons. In the early morning light, I stand beside the ordered piles of cannon shot, gleaming blackly with restoration at the castle gates. All of a sudden, I see approaching several resolute people on a mission. They rush towards me and take me strongly by the arms. I feel a dizzying melting of time and place, time and space. In these disorienting moments reverberates the violent shock of past ambushes. Is it my imagination, the rattle of chains, the moans of fellow captives? I am raised to the bony shoulders of half a dozen men. I do not know them, yet somehow they are familiar. They hold my limbs firmly and begin to run, at first at a slow, unhurried pace, but purposeful and gathering momentum. I am in a daze and powerless, able only to note that others are closing in behind us. But when I turn my head, I see women, children, young men who are all following. Is that enough? Keep going. The procession jogs its way through town. The streets are narrowed by the gathering crowd. People lean from balconies, crane from shuttered windows, and cheer. I feel myself supported, psychologically as well as physically. This is not a dream, I tell myself, although it is so far from my normal London life that it might as well be. This is my family. Through my grandmother's line, we are royal, a stool family, I remind myself, and I've been chosen to fill a vacant stool. I recall stories I was once told of a similar fate befalling an older cousin many years ago who struggled pointlessly to run away from those bent on enforcing his reluctant installation. They could even come for you on the streets of London or New York, I was warned. There is no protest to this kidnapping, no escape, no refusal.
Not only the famous writers, Margaret, owe you a huge debt. We all do, everybody here, and we salute you. And we hope that you continue doing all the wonderful work you've done. You've made so many stools for some of us to stand on and sit on, and thank you.
I just want to thank you, Marina, because without you, we wouldn't all be here. So.
Thank you so much.
Give you a hug.
Yeah.
It's true.
I want to present Margaret with something. In the 1990s, I made a program about her for the BBC. And when I was clearing out and clearing up, I found a whole wad of newspaper clippings, which is my duty to give you now after all these years. There are lots of pictures of her looking really smart and cute. Margaret's huge collection of pictures. Are we going to do that? Oh, look, yes. You see? Show. Sonny Rollins. Sonny Rollins. My sister.
Everyone, please, another big round of applause for Margaret and for Marina. And note, as I did sitting in the audience, that Margaret, as a publisher and editor, knows how to sell books. She's matching the cover of her book. Margaret, will you hold up the book? We can see the green of the book cover is the identical green of her dress. Margaret, I just want to say my own personal thanks to you for not just for coming back to the festival this year and for this book, but as Marina says, for all of the work you've done. I mean, our festival theme this year, as you all know, because I keep repeating it, is all together now. And I think that's been the theme of your career as a publisher. You know, the same way we always say literature is for everybody, that's what's driven you throughout your career. And we all thank you for that. So thank you very much. So somehow, this is the last event here at the old fire station at the festival this year. You're all supposed to say, "Oh." And I have just 5 things to tell you before we wrap up. Number 1. Oh yeah, sorry. Okay, this is very important. Many of you are going to want Margaret to sign your book. She's not going to sign it up on stage because we have a perfectly nice table set up outside where she can do it comfortably. So as we end, once I tell you my 5 things, we're going to whisk her out this door, and then you can run and join the queue to get your book signed outside, okay? Here are my 5 things. The good news is that even though this is the last event in the fire station, it is not the last event in the festival. The National Poetry Slam Finals are starting in just over an hour at Napa. There are a few tickets left. My colleague Georgia is sitting in the front row with some tickets in her hands. If anyone wants to make a last-minute snap decision to buy a ticket and go to the National Poetry Slam Finals, you don't even need to leave the room to do it. And if Bocas is like the literary version of Carnival for Trinidad, tonight is last lap, right? The slam is last lap. This is your last chance. That's number 1. Number 2, remember that even though the festival may be ending today, we don't stop. Bocas operates year-round from our headquarters at the Writers' Center. We do events every month, sometimes more than once a month, for all ages. So if you want to continue to keep up with us, there's some simple things you can do. You can follow us on social media, sign up for our newsletter, come and visit the Writers' Center to see what we have going on. Number 3, the thing that you've all heard me say so many times that you can probably recite the script. If you have enjoyed this event and if you've been stimulated by the festival and you'd like us to continue to do what we do and to offer all this free programming, there is a donation box at the door. On your way out, feel free to put your spare change or a very large check in the donation box. It makes it possible for us to do what we do here and not sell tickets. 4th thing is just to say thank you. It's to say thank you to all the writers, to all of our sponsors and partners who make this possible. NALIS, the National Library, our hosts here, AVIT for the screens, Amplia for the live stream, Office Authority for the printed materials, the diplomatic missions, all of the partners, everyone who helps us make the festival possible. But above all, I have to say thank you to the audience, because there's no festival without an audience. Nobody wants to be up here on stage talking and reading to empty chairs. So please thank yourselves with a round of applause. Very last thing to tell you, unless something extremely dramatic and unexpected happens in the state of the world, which it could because of the world we live in, we will be back next year in about 12 months' time at the 2027 Bocas Lit Fest. So see you then. Thank you very much for coming.